Sheriff Dale Harper thought it was going to be another easy afternoon. He thought the woman in the silver rental car would do what everyone else in Caldwell County did: lower her eyes, speak softly, and answer every question without pushing back. He thought she would apologize for nothing, nod at everything, and drive away grateful that he had let her go. He had done this 100 times before, and it had always gone the same way. The badge on his chest had never failed to produce the reaction he wanted. But on this particular Tuesday morning, in this particular stretch of highway just outside the small town of Grover Mills, Georgia, something was about to go very differently. And Sheriff Dale Harper, a man who had spent 22 years believing that authority was something you wore rather than earned, was about to learn a lesson that no amount of experience in his particular kind of policing had ever prepared him for. He smiled as he approached the car. 5 minutes later, he wasn't smiling anymore. Dr. Maya Richardson had been on the road since 6 in the morning. She had flown into Atlanta the night before, checked into a mid-range hotel near the airport, and risen early to drive the 2.5 hours south toward Fort Caldwell, a mid-sized Army installation that sat at the intersection of two rural highways and handled logistics coordination for several classified defense programs. Maya had been to Fort Caldwell before, though not in a long time. This trip was different. She had been requested specifically by name by a 2-star general who had worked with her on a previous project and trusted her judgment more than he trusted most of the people who reported directly to him. The meeting was scheduled for 11 o'clock. It was now a few minutes past 9, and Maya was on track. She wore what she usually wore when traveling for work: dark slacks, a fitted blazer, no jewelry except a thin silver watch. Her hair was natural, pulled back. She carried no uniform, no insignia, no outward indication of who she was or what she did. That was how she preferred it. She was a private person in a very public kind of work, and the contrast suited her fine. She had just crossed into Grover Mills when she noticed the lights, blue and red, spinning lazily in her rearview mirror. She checked her speed. She was doing exactly the posted limit, and felt the particular calm that comes to people who have been pulled over before for no good reason and have learned to treat the experience with the detachment of someone watching it happen to a stranger. She pulled to the shoulder, turned off the engine, and waited with both hands visible on the steering wheel. She had driven enough miles in enough southern states to know that the first 30 seconds of a traffic stop often determined the character of everything that followed. The cruiser rolled up slowly behind her. A door opened. Footsteps crunched on the gravel shoulder. And then Sheriff Dale Harper appeared at her window, one thumb hooked in his belt, his face wearing the particular expression of a man who has already decided what kind of interaction this is going to be, before he has said a single word. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. It was a technique she recognized it immediately designed to put people off balance, to establish from the very first second that the silence belonged to him and the discomfort belonged to her. Maya held his gaze without expression. Harper asked for her license and registration. She provided them without comment. He looked at the license for longer than necessary, turning it over once as if checking for watermarks, then looked back at her, with eyes that had shifted from professionally neutral to something slightly harder. He asked where she was headed. She told him she was going to Fort Caldwell. He asked why. She told him she had a meeting. He asked what kind of meeting. She said it was a professional engagement. He asked again, differently, with the particular inflection of a man who has decided that a vague answer is a suspicious answer, and that suspicion is sufficient cause for whatever comes next. And Maya, who had answered variations of this question, from men like Dale Harper in a dozen different counties, across a dozen different years, took a breath and said, calmly, without hostility, without performance of any kind, "With respect, sir, could you tell me what I was stopped for?" The question was reasonable. The tone was measured. But to Dale Harper, standing on the gravel shoulder with 22 years of unchallenged authority at his back, it landed like a door being slammed in his face. His jaw tightened. A small movement, almost imperceptible, but Maya caught it. She had spent a career reading rooms, reading faces, reading the gap between what people said and what they meant, and she read Dale Harper without difficulty. He had expected deference and received a question instead. He had expected nerves and found composure. And something in that composure, in the quiet steadiness of her voice, in the fact that she had asked him to account for himself, rather than simply handing over her dignity along with her license, had gotten under his skin in a way that he would not have been able to explain, but also would not have tried to. He told her to step out of the vehicle. She asked why. He repeated the instruction without explanation. She complied, standing on the shoulder with the same measured calm she had maintained since the moment he arrived, one hand holding her blazer closed against the morning wind. Harper told her he was going to search the vehicle. She asked on what grounds. He said he had reason to believe. She asked what reason. He talked over her. She tried again, calmly, precisely, citing the specific legal standard, reasonable, articulable suspicion, the same language she had heard in legal briefings and policy reviews, and the formal documents that crossed her desk on a regular basis. A small crowd had begun to gather at the edge of the service road, two men on foot, a woman who had pulled her truck to the shoulder across the highway and was watching from a distance. Harper glanced at them once, then back at Maya. Something shifted in his posture. She had mentioned her rights, out loud, in public, in front of witnesses, and that, for a man like Dale Harper, was not a request for dialogue. It was a challenge. He turned to a deputy who had pulled up behind the cruiser while they were speaking, a young officer named Travis, who had been with the department for only 8 months, and who already understood, in the way that young people understand things they have not been taught explicitly, that his continued employment required him not to ask certain questions. Harper gave the order with the same casual confidence he used for everything, as if the fact of his wanting it made it automatically permissible. Search the vehicle. Travis did as he was told. He searched methodically and thoroughly, and found exactly nothing. No contraband, no weapons, no open containers, no grounds for anything. He straightened up and looked at Harper with an expression that sat somewhere between relief and dread. Harper stood with his arms crossed, watching him. For a moment, the only sound was the wind and the distant engine of a passing truck. And then, in front of the gathered observers, in front of Travis, in front of the woman watching from across the highway, Harper turned to Maya Richardson and said, "I don't like your attitude." The words fell flat in the morning air. Maya looked at him. She did not respond immediately. She was, in that moment, the calmest person on that stretch of highway, and everyone present seemed to feel it. The strange inversion of who should have been rattled and who was. Harper took a step forward. "Take her in," he said. The ride to the Caldwell County Sheriff's Department took 11 minutes. Maya sat in the back of the cruiser with her wrists in handcuffs, watching the Georgia countryside scroll past the window. She did not cry. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice or make any sound at all beyond the quiet, controlled breathing of someone who has decided that emotion is a resource to be conserved rather than spent. Travis drove and did not look in the rearview mirror more than twice, and both times he looked away quickly. The radio played something country and upbeat that seemed to belong to a completely different universe than the one currently in progress inside that vehicle. The sheriff's department occupied a squat brick building on the main road through Grover Mills, flanked by a hardware store and a closed diner. Inside, it smelled of burnt coffee and old carpet. Harper came in behind them with the energy of a man returning from a successful hunt, loud in the way that men become loud when they want everyone in the room to feel the weight of their authority. He recounted the stop for a desk sergeant named Carl, embellishing lightly, giving the version of events in which a difficult woman had pushed her luck and been appropriately corrected. Carl laughed at the right moments. 2 other deputies near the coffee machine looked over with mild interest. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked directly at Maya, who stood with her hands still cuffed, watching the room with the attentiveness of someone cataloging every detail for later use. She was processed with practiced efficiency: phone, purse, identification, blazer taken and logged, placed in a plastic bin. Maya asked to make a call to her attorney. Harper told her she would get her call when he decided she was ready for it. She asked a second time, clearly, citing her right. He waved it off with the particular gesture of a man who has never had to take that right seriously in his own building. "Here," he said, gesturing at the walls around him. "I am the law. It was the kind of line that sounded powerful in the moment and would sound very different in a federal deposition 3 weeks later. He walked away. A deputy guided Maya down a short corridor toward a row of holding cells, 4 of them, 3 empty, one occupied by a sleeping man in work boots. The cell door closed behind her with a sound that Harper, in his office, probably found satisfying. Maya stood in the center of the cell for a moment. Then she sat down on the metal bench, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Before the deputy had taken 3 steps back toward the main room, she spoke. Her voice was level, unhurried, clear enough to carry through the bars. You should go tell your boss that he just made the biggest mistake of his career. Harper heard it. He was close enough. He turned at his office door and looked down the corridor with an expression that had the shape of contempt, but something else in the eyes. Not quite doubt. Not yet, but the shadow of it. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, the kind of sound men make when they want to seem unbothered, without committing to the performance, and went into his office and closed the door. He poured himself coffee from a machine on the credenza. He sat behind his desk and looked at the arrest report Travis had begun filling out, and thought about what he would have for lunch. He had been in that chair for 15 years, first as a deputy himself, then as undersheriff, then in the job he currently held. And in 15 years he had learned that the people who threatened consequences rarely had any. He had learned that the badge was a kind of insulation, that the building around him was a kind of fortress, that the county around that building was a kind of kingdom, and that kingdoms, properly managed, could weather almost anything. He took a long sip of coffee and waited for the morning to go back to normal. The secure line rang at 9:47. It sat in the corner of the room on a separate handset, a direct government line used for coordination with Fort Caldwell and a handful of other federal installations in the region. It rarely rang. Harper looked at it without moving for a moment, then nodded at Travis, who had come in with additional paperwork to answer it. Travis picked up the handset. The change in his face was immediate, not dramatic, not a visible flinch, but a subtle, complete reorganization of his expression, as if the muscles had received instructions from somewhere deeper than habit. He looked toward the corridor, then back at the phone. He said, "Yes, sir," once, quietly. Then he held out the handset to Harper and said, in a voice that was careful and very even, "It's for you, Sheriff. It's about the woman in holding." Harper took the handset with one hand and set down his coffee with the other. He put it to his ear and said his name. There was a pause, and then the voice on the other end asked, professionally and without preamble, where Dr. Maya Richardson was and whether she had been harmed. Before Harper could form a complete sentence in response, the regular desk phone rang. Carl answered it from the front. Through the glass partition, Harper could see Carl's face change in the same way Travis's had that same quiet reorganization, that same look toward the corridor. Carl put the call on hold and picked up a second incoming line that had lit up almost simultaneously. The secure handset in Harper's own hand was still waiting for an answer. In the 41 seconds between the first ring of the secure line and the moment Harper understood that something had gone fundamentally wrong, 3 separate calls had come in, asking the same question about the same person. The voice on the secure handset, which Harper had initially assumed was some kind of routine administrative call, repeated itself with a precision that made the request feel less like a request and more like a formal notice. "Sheriff, you need to release her immediately." Harper pulled the handset away from his ear and looked at it. He put it back. He asked who he was speaking with. The caller identified himself by name and title, a name Harper did not recognize, a title that included the words Department of Defense and Senior Director. Harper's first instinct was the instinct of a man who has spent 22 years being the largest authority in any room he has entered. He did not believe it. He told the caller he did not respond to anonymous tips about his own prisoners. The caller repeated his full name and title, without raising his voice. Harper said he would need to verify before releasing anyone that this was his county and his department and his decision to make. The caller said, simply, that verification was already in progress and that it would take approximately 4 minutes, and that Harper might want to use those 4 minutes wisely. Then the line was quiet in a way that was not the same as being on hold. Harper hung up. He was still deciding whether the call was a prank, an overreaction, someone's misguided attempt to leverage a personal relationship into getting a friend released from a holding cell. When Carl appeared in the doorway with an expression Harper had not seen on him in 15 years of working together, Carl said the governor's office had called. Harper looked at him. Carl said the state attorney general's office had called too. And while Carl was still speaking, the direct line on Harper's desk rang again, not the secure federal line, the regular line, and Carl answered it before Harper could, and went pale, and said quietly, like a man trying not to frighten children, "It's federal legal counsel, Dale." The atmosphere in the building had changed completely by the time Harper stood up from behind his desk. The two deputies by the coffee machine had stopped talking. Travis stood near the corridor entrance with his hands at his sides. Carl remained in the doorway. The sounds of the building, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant rattle of a ceiling vent seemed louder now, filling the silence that had replaced the casual noise of a normal morning. Harper straightened his jacket, walked to his office door, and stood for a moment in the frame. He did not speak. The air in the room had the quality of a held breath. A deputy handed him a single sheet of paper, a fax that had come through on the federal line, a document that had been sent from a government office 230 miles away. Harper looked at it. The document referenced a security clearance level. It referenced a name. It referenced a current operational assignment. And it concluded with a brief, formal request that the named individual be released without delay, signed by someone whose position in the national defense structure was not in any way ambiguous. Harper stood with the paper in his hand and understood, for the first time, what was sitting in his holding cell. The fax was 2 pages. Harper read both of them, standing at his desk, not sitting, which was itself unusual. He was a man who sat behind furniture to receive bad news, the way men in his position often did, using the solidity of wood and distance as a kind of psychological armor. But this he read standing, and when he finished he set the pages down and was still for several seconds in a way that Travis, watching from across the room, would later describe as looking like someone had cut the power to him. The first page was the formal release request. The second page was a summary, not classified a summary, intentionally prepared for sharing with non-cleared personnel, which itself said something about how little ambiguity the people sending it were willing to tolerate. Dr. Maya Richardson had a doctorate in applied systems analysis from a university whose engineering program ranked among the top 4 in the country. She had spent the first 6 years after her degree in private defense contracting before being recruited directly by the Department of Defense. She was the lead architect of a strategic planning framework that was currently being implemented across 3 combatant commands. She had advised on logistics for 2 major international security initiatives, the names of which did not appear anywhere in the summary because they were classified. She held a security clearance that put her in a category of access that fewer than 300 civilians in the United States could claim. She had, in the past calendar year, been present in rooms with people whose names appeared on the covers of newspapers, and she had been in those rooms not as a guest or an observer, but as the expert whose input those people were waiting to hear. She was, in the language of the defense community, a critical asset. She was, in the language of the people who had spent the last 20 minutes trying to reach Dale Harper's office, someone who should not, under any circumstances, have been sitting in a county holding cell in Georgia because a sheriff did not like the way she asked a question. Harper sat down. He looked at the wall. He thought, perhaps for the first time in a very long time, about the specific mechanics of consequence, not the abstract idea of it, the way men in his position sometimes acknowledged it as a distant possibility, but the concrete, specific, irreversible kind. Around him, the deputies were doing the math that he was doing, and their faces showed the calculation in various stages. Travis already at the answer, Carl catching up, the 2 near the coffee machine still working through the variables. None of them spoke. From somewhere down the corridor came the faint, unhurried sound of a woman breathing in a holding cell, the sound of someone who had never stopped waiting, because she had always known exactly what was coming. Outside, at the far end of the main road, through Grover Mills, a convoy of 3 black vehicles had turned off the interstate and was moving toward the building at a measured, unhurried pace that somehow communicated more urgency than speed would have. Harper moved quickly, though not quickly enough to look composed. He went to the corridor himself, which was something he had not done since the arrest. He had left the management of the cell to others, maintaining the theatrical remove of a man who had made his point and moved on. He unlocked the door himself, which he also did not usually do, and pulled it open and looked in at Maya Richardson, who looked back at him from the metal bench with an expression that had not changed in the 43 minutes since it closed. He began to explain. He used the words misunderstanding and unfortunately and procedural, which are the words people use when they have done something indefensible and need to reframe it as something that happened to everyone involved rather than something one specific person did deliberately to another. Maya stood and walked to the cell door without responding to any of it. She held out her wrists for the cuffs to be removed. Harper called Travis, who removed them. Maya retrieved her blazer from the plastic bin without speaking, put it on, and buttoned it with the same deliberate calm she had maintained throughout. Outside the building, 2 of the 3 black vehicles had pulled to the curb. A federal attorney named James Whitmore had already placed calls to the State Bar and to the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division. A second attorney, traveling in the 3rd vehicle, was on the phone with someone at the Pentagon confirming that Dr. Richardson was unharmed. Inside the department, a paralegal from the federal legal team was requesting access to security camera footage. A supervisor from the state attorney's office had arrived on foot, having driven separately from the convoy, and was standing in the lobby with Carl and asking quiet, specific, unanswerable questions about the basis for the arrest. The word basis kept appearing, in different inflections, from different people, and each time it did, another person in the building became slightly smaller. One deputy near the back exit made a call to a personal attorney. The coffee machine ran a full cycle that no one had programmed, and no one went to collect. Harper stood in the corridor with his hands at his sides and watched Maya walk past him toward the lobby. She did not look at him. He said her name, Dr. Richardson, with a different inflection than anything he had used before, the inflection of a man who has just understood the full meaning of a word he thought he knew. Maya stopped walking. She turned and looked at him, and for one moment they stood in the corridor of his building, surrounded by the accumulating wreckage of the morning he had made, and the look on her face was not triumph and not contempt, but something quieter and more complete. The look of someone who has seen this before, has always known how it ends, and is simply waiting to get back to the work she was already in the middle of, before any of this interrupted her. The federal investigators were efficient and thorough, in a way that left no room for the kind of selective memory that institutions under scrutiny sometimes develop about their own records. 3 teams worked in parallel. 1, securing the physical camera footage from the sheriff's department's own system, 1 documenting the paperwork surrounding the arrest, and 1 conducting preliminary interviews with every officer who had been present at any point during the morning. The lead attorney, a woman named Sandra Calloway, who had spent 11 years in the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and who had the quiet, methodical energy of someone who has conducted hundreds of these investigations and has never once confused efficiency with carelessness, set up a temporary command point in the conference room that had been cleared for federal use and began building the timeline with the careful attention of someone who knows that timelines, properly constructed, have the ability to make certain kinds of dishonesty impossible. The camera footage was particularly clear. The exterior camera at the traffic stop, mounted on Harper's cruiser, had captured the entirety of the encounter on the highway shoulder in high definition and with audio. The cell corridor camera had captured the intake, the removal of personal belongings, and the period of confinement. The front desk camera had captured the calls coming in and the faces of the officers receiving them. Sandra Calloway watched the cruiser footage once in full, then twice more, at reduced speed, and did not say anything while it played. When it ended the second time, she made a single note in the margin of her working document that consisted of 4 words, 2 of which were the phrase, "no basis." The arrest report itself was a document that several federal attorneys would later describe, in private conversations with colleagues, as a work of creative fiction. It cited disorderly conduct as the basis for the arrest, which the camera footage rendered obviously untenable. It described Maya as uncooperative and resistant, which the footage also contradicted. It listed the offense time as 9:42 which was 3 minutes after the secure government line had already begun ringing in Harper's office. A fact that a timeline analyst would later note as meaningful, implying that the paperwork may have been backdated to look more complete than it was at the time the investigation began. These were not minor discrepancies. They were the kind of discrepancies that, in the legal vocabulary of federal oversight, are referred to as indicators of a pattern. And a pattern was exactly what emerged. The young officer who had introduced himself to the federal team as Deputy Marcus Webb had been with the department for 8 months, and had, in those 8 months, been quietly accumulating his own record of what he had witnessed. He had 3 entries in a personal notebook: dates, times, descriptions that he had written down on evenings when he came home from shifts feeling the particular discomfort of someone who has witnessed something wrong and has not yet found the words or the moment to say so. The federal investigators gave him the words and the moment simultaneously, and Marcus Webb, 26 years old, 4 months past the probationary period of his first law enforcement job, sat down in a conference room that had been borrowed from the hardware store next door and spoke for 47 minutes without stopping. He described incidents going back to at least 14 months before this Tuesday morning. He described a pattern of stops, detentions, and intimidation, targeting specific demographics on specific roads. He described the culture inside the building, the laughter, the casual validation of behavior that should have prompted complaint rather than applause. He described the silence of people who knew and said nothing, including, with difficulty, and something that was probably shame, himself. When he finished, the federal attorney across the table closed her folder and said, "Thank you. This took courage." Marcus Webb nodded and looked at the table and said he wished he had done it sooner. The formal suspension of Sheriff Dale Harper from duty was not a private affair. That was not how these things worked in Caldwell County, where news traveled at the speed of a radio scanner and a federal vehicle in front of the sheriff's department was the kind of event that pulled observers from 3 blocks away. By 2 in the afternoon, the stretch of sidewalk outside the building held a loosely organized crowd of perhaps 40 people, some curious, some angry, some quiet, some recording with their phones. The local paper had sent its only full-time staff reporter. A television crew from a station in Augusta had arrived in a van that was double-parked and running. Inside the building, the proceedings had the formal quality of a document being served. Each step announced in advance, conducted according to protocol, witnessed and recorded. The federal attorney read the suspension order aloud. A state official collected the badge and the service weapon. System access was revoked. A second official collected the keys to the cruiser. Harper stood at the center of it, with the bewildered quality of a man who has spent a career believing that certain things happen to other people, and is encountering for the first time the fact that he is not, and has never been, the exception he believed himself to be. The people who spoke afterward, some to reporters, some to the federal investigators, some to no one in particular, used words that were less about Harper himself and more about the accumulation. A woman who had lived in Grover Mills for 31 years said she had tried to file a complaint 5 years ago and been told by a desk officer that she had misunderstood what happened to her. A man who drove a delivery route through the county said he had learned to take a different road, not a road that was shorter, not a road that was more convenient, but a road that added 20 minutes to a shift he already worked for low wages, because 20 minutes was a price he had concluded was worth paying, to avoid the stretch of highway near Grover Mills where certain encounters were more likely. A former deputy who had resigned 2 years earlier said he had submitted a written internal complaint and received, in return, a meeting with Harper that ended with a discussion of his future with the department that he had understood as a threat. He had quit the following week and moved to a neighboring county, and spent 2 years believing he had been the only one who had noticed, which was the particular loneliness of people who are certain something is wrong and equally certain that saying so will cost them something they cannot afford to lose. The federal investigators told him he was not the only one. He was one of 7 who had attempted some form of internal complaint in the past 8 years. None of those complaints had resulted in documented action of any kind. None of these people were named in initial reports. All of them had been silent for a long time. The investigation, it became apparent within the first 24 hours, was not going to be a small thing. It was going to be the kind of investigation that requires a dedicated case number and a coordinating attorney and a timeline that extends beyond weeks into months. Harper was escorted from the building at 2:27 in the afternoon. He walked through the lobby and through the front door and into the kind of sunlight that seems crueler than usual on days when everything has gone wrong. He did not look at the cameras. He did not speak to the reporters. He got into a personal vehicle, not the cruiser, which now belonged to the department's evidence log, and drove away in a direction that none of the observers were watching closely enough to note. Behind him, the building he had occupied for 15 years continued to function, because institutions continue to function, because the work that needs doing in a county does not stop because the man who was doing it badly has been removed. Travis, who had watched the entire morning with the expression of a man undergoing something that was going to take time to process, found himself answering phones at the front desk. He did so with careful, precise politeness, and when someone called with a question about a parking violation, he handled it correctly and professionally, and no one watching would have been able to tell that he was, internally, beginning the long process of deciding what kind of officer he wanted to be. Maya Richardson stood outside the federal building that had been designated as a temporary operations point for the investigation, in a parking lot that was filling slowly with vehicles and personnel, and the particular organized activity of people who have a great deal of work to do. A journalist from a regional outlet had identified her and was standing at a respectful distance, waiting. Two others had joined him. She had been asked by the federal attorneys whether she wanted to make any public statement, and she had said yes, not immediately, but yes. She had spent the intervening time reviewing the documents that had accumulated over the afternoon, making 2 calls on a replacement phone provided by the federal team, and eating a sandwich from a bag that someone had left on a conference table and that she consumed with the focused efficiency of a person who has realized they missed breakfast. She looked tired. She looked composed. There was nothing performative about either quality. Both were simply true, and she wore them the same way she wore everything without decoration, without apology. She walked to where the journalists were waiting and stood in the afternoon light, without notes, without preparation, and spoke. She did not celebrate. There was no visible satisfaction in her face, no release of tension that might have signaled a personal victory. She spoke for perhaps 6 minutes, in a register that was neither legal nor political, but something more like the voice of someone who has thought about a problem for a long time and is stating, plainly, what she has concluded. She said the events of that morning were not primarily about one man or one department or one county in Georgia. She said they were about the conditions that produce a man like Dale Harper, the absence of oversight, the presence of unchecked authority, the culture of institutional silence that allows individual abuses to accumulate into something systemic. She said she was not angry, or rather, that she was not only angry that anger was an appropriate response to injustice, but that it was not, by itself, a sufficient one. She said the response needed to be accountability. Specific, documented, enforceable, and consistent, regardless of who the person in the holding cell happened to be. She said that the reason this particular morning had ended the way it did was not because she had powerful friends or a particular title. She said, slowly and clearly, that it should have ended this way for everyone who had ever been stopped on that highway without cause, everyone who had filed a complaint that went nowhere, everyone who had changed their route to avoid a road they had every right to drive. She said the investigation that was beginning was not about her, it was about them. The crowd that had gathered at the perimeter of the parking lot was quiet while she spoke. When she finished, a woman near the back, older, in a gray jacket, began to clap, and then others joined, and it spread not loudly or dramatically, but steadily, in the unhurried way of something that had been waiting to happen for a long time. Maya nodded once, turned away from the microphones, and went back to work. The investigation expanded to encompass the full 22-year span of Dale Harper's tenure in law enforcement within Caldwell County. The scope of what the federal team uncovered over the following weeks was not surprising to people who had lived in certain parts of Grover Mills for a long time, but it was extensive in the way that documented evidence is always more extensive than the privately held knowledge that precedes it. Traffic stop records showed a pattern of stops in specific geographic areas that was statistically inconsistent with any legitimate enforcement rationale. Complaint records showed a pattern of complaints dismissed without investigation during the years Harper had been in authority. Internal communications showed a culture in which these practices were discussed openly, in the institutional shorthand of people who do not believe they will ever be held to account for what they are saying. Marcus Webb cooperated fully throughout. He was placed on administrative leave during the investigation, as was standard procedure, and spent part of that time preparing a written account that the federal team described as detailed and credible. 3 other officers eventually provided additional testimony. 2 did so, after being advised by personal attorneys that cooperation was in their interest. 1 did so without prompting, on the second day of the investigation, in a brief meeting with the lead federal attorney, in which he said, with no apparent drama, that he had wanted to say something for a long time and was glad the opportunity had finally arrived. Harper retained a private attorney who made several public statements in the weeks that followed, each one slightly less confident than the last, each one walking back some portion of the previous position as new documentation became available. The statements moved through several stages: the initial claim that the arrest had been lawful and the federal interest was overreach, then the claim that, while mistakes may have been made, they were not intentional, then the claim that any pattern in the stop records reflected local crime conditions rather than discriminatory intent, and finally, the statement that released only by his attorney, in which Harper expressed that he regretted that the morning had unfolded the way it had, and wished the best for all parties involved. The phrase "all parties involved" was noted by several people who read it as the particular kind of language people use when they want to acknowledge something without naming what it is. The formal charges were filed 7 weeks after the initial incident. They included civil rights violations, abuse of authority, and obstruction, the last charge, arising from findings related to the arrest report timeline. The charges were not only against Harper. A supervisory deputy and 1 desk officer also faced formal proceedings. The county itself entered into a consent agreement with state oversight authorities that included mandatory training, new complaint procedures, an independent review board for future misconduct allegations, and a requirement for all traffic stop data to be submitted to a state database for quarterly analysis. None of these were small or easily reversed measures. They were the kind of structural changes that, when they are implemented and maintained, make it harder for the next Dale Harper to become Dale Harper. Maya was back at Fort Caldwell by 4 in the afternoon of the day it happened. The meeting she had been traveling to, when the cruiser lights appeared in her mirror, had been rescheduled to 3 o'clock once the federal team had confirmed she was available and cleared to travel. She arrived with her replacement phone, her blazer rebuttoned, her hair still pulled back, and the composed attentiveness she brought to every professional engagement regardless of what had preceded it. The general who had requested her was waiting in the conference room with 3 other officers and a civilian analyst. He shook her hand and held it for a moment longer than a routine handshake, the way people do when a handshake is meant to carry more than greeting. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had been briefed on the morning and did not entirely know what to say about it, not because he lacked words, but because the right words for a situation like that do not come readily to people who have spent careers in environments where directness is valued above sentiment. She told him she was fine, and that they should get started because she had already reviewed the materials on the drive over and had 3 specific recommendations to discuss. He said, with the careful sincerity of a man who has spent decades in situations where careful sincerity is the right register, "Maya, I'm sorry about what happened today." She nodded. She said, "So am I, for a lot of people." And then she opened her folder and got to work. She did not discuss the morning in professional settings after that day. She did not write about it publicly or seek any ongoing attention from it. She had made the statement she intended to make, and it was in the record now, and the investigation was proceeding, and the work she had come to Georgia to do was important and demanded her full attention, because it always did, because it had always been that way. And a Tuesday morning in Grover Mills, Georgia, however significant in its own terms, was not going to interrupt the larger project she had been working on since before Dale Harper had ever heard her name. That was all. The journalists who followed up with interview requests received polite responses from an office administrator declining on her behalf. The one television appearance she agreed to, several months later, was specific in its focus. She talked about systemic accountability, about the structural conditions that enable abuse of authority, about what oversight mechanisms actually look like when they work, and about the difference between individual accountability and institutional change. She did not describe the details of the morning or express personal feelings about Dale Harper. When a host pressed her on the question of how it felt to have been handcuffed and placed in a holding cell for asking a civil question, she was quiet for a moment and then said, "The way it felt was the way it always feels. The difference was what happened afterward. That's what we should be trying to make normal." In Grover Mills, the changes were visible and gradual, accumulating ways that are the only ways real change ever becomes visible in places that have spent a long time staying the same. The new complaint process was publicized in the local paper and at town meetings that drew larger audiences than town meetings in Grover Mills had drawn in recent memory, which itself said something about what people had been waiting to be given the opportunity to say. The quarterly traffic stop data, for the first time in the county's recorded history, became a public document available for review on the county website. Raw numbers, stop locations, outcome records, the kind of transparency that looks bureaucratic until you consider what the absence of it had permitted for more than 2 decades. The Independent Review Board held its first meeting 4 months after the consent agreement was signed in the community room of a public library and was attended by more people than the room was designed to hold, which required a second table and a doorway left open so those standing in the corridor could hear. Marcus Webb, who had been reinstated after the investigation concluded, attended in his uniform. He sat in the back when an older man near the front, who had been talking about a stop that had happened to his son 3 years earlier, finished speaking and the room was quiet. Marcus Webb raised his hand. The moderator recognized him. He stood up and said, in front of everyone, that he was sorry for how long it had taken and that he intended to do better. The room was quiet for a moment. Then the older man nodded. That was all. It was enough. The case was discussed in law school classrooms, in policy papers, in the training materials used by the Federal Civil Rights Division when preparing oversight teams for jurisdictions under review. It was cited in a Senate subcommittee hearing on law enforcement accountability, briefly and precisely, by a senator who used it to illustrate a larger point about the relationship between institutional culture and individual misconduct, the way that individual behavior does not emerge in isolation, but is shaped and enabled by the environment around it, by what is permitted and what is not, by who is accountable to whom and for what, and under what conditions. Maya's public statement from the parking lot was quoted accurately and in full, with proper attribution, in 2 published academic papers and 1 government report. She did not see most of this at the time. She was, as she generally was, working. Sheriff Dale Harper had built 22 years on a single assumption, that the badge entitled him to the behavior, that the county was his domain, and the people in it were his to manage as he saw fit, that the authority he wore on his chest was the same as the authority that actually governs the world, and that the world would confirm this whenever he needed it to. He had built this assumption, not in a single day, but over 2 decades of incremental decisions, each one unchallenged, each one reinforcing the next, until the assumption had become so solid beneath him that he had stopped noticing it was an assumption at all. He had stopped noticing it was something that could be examined, tested, and found to be false. And on a Tuesday morning in September, on a gravel shoulder outside Grover Mills, he had tested it against a woman who had spent her career at the place where real authority lives, where decisions about national security are made, where the weight of consequence is measured in things larger than a county, and the assumption had failed, as assumptions built on unchecked power always fail when they encounter something that does not yield to them. He had put her in a holding cell for asking a question. He had taken her phone and her identification and told her that he was the law. And the law, the actual law, had spent the next 43 minutes organizing its response and then arrived in 3 black vehicles and dismantled everything he had spent 22 years building. Not because of who she was, though who she was is what made the response so swift, but because of what she had been right about from the beginning, that the behavior was wrong, that the authority he claimed was not the authority he had, that the morning he had treated as a small display of power was, in fact, exactly the kind of morning that defines a career. He thought he was locking a woman in a cell because of her attitude. He did not know, until the facts arrived, that the attitude he was trying to contain was the same quality that had made her one of the most consequential professionals in her field: the willingness to ask the right question clearly, without apology, and to wait for the answer without flinching. The cell door had barely closed before the world began moving to open it. And by the time the convoy reached the end of the main road through Grover Mills, the only door that had actually closed, the kind that does not reopen, belonged to Dale Harper. Sheriff Harper thought he had locked a woman away for attitude. What he had actually done was lock the door on his own career from the inside.